Hello, my name is Latanya Richmond, and I serve as Dean of Multicultural Affairs at Smith College. I want to thank the Smith College Department of Music for making today's event possible. As someone who grew up in the church, I was always surrounded by gospel and spiritual music. For me, it provided a foundation and reminder of where I came from, and having that foundation early on was extremely important. It kept me grounded, and it was and still is today my go-to music for sharing stories, finding strength, healing, and feeling and being empowered. Today, it is my distinct honor to welcome you to Singing Spirituals and Gospel, a conversation with Randye Jones and Rollo Dilworth. Today's event will include a discussion of the history and performance practice of African American spirituals and gospel with author and soprano Randye Jones, who wrote the book So You Want to Sing Spirituals, and composer and conductor Rollo Dilworth, who has had more than 150 compositions and arrangements published. A native of Greensboro, North Carolina, Randye Jones first learned about spirituals in her home church of North Carolina. She received her Bachelor of Arts degree in music education from Bennett College, and while there, she was named to Who's Who among students in American colleges and universities. Jones earned her master's degree in vocal performance from Florida State University and continued graduate study in vocal literature at the University of Iowa. Jones' professional affiliations have included Phi Beta Delta International Honor Society, the National Association of Negro Musicians, Society of American Music, Music Library Association, the Association of Black Women Historians, the Coalition for African Americans in the Performing Arts, the Recording Academy, and the Washington Area Music Association. Over the past 25 years, Jones has served as a music cataloger for the Florida State University libraries before accepting a library manager position at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. She is presently on the library staff working with the audiovisual collections at Grinnell College. As a young boy, Rollo Dilworth was impassioned by singing experiences in his school and church choirs. At the age of 11, he began experimenting with the music he was given by testing out alternate pitches and rhythms. His elementary music teacher fostered this curiosity by realizing his work. This period marked the beginning of his love for studying music theory and piano, arranging music, which he quickly discovered that he wanted to pursue music as a career. To fulfill his ambitions, Dilworth continued his education at Case Western University. There, he continued his study of voice and piano and received a Bachelor of Science degree in music education. He spent a year teaching elementary school music full-time while also attending the University of Missouri, St. Louis, to complete a master's degree in secondary education. After completing the master's degree, Dilworth spent another year teaching elementary music. He then continued on to receive a DMA in conducting. During his professional career, Dilworth has served as the director of the music education and choral programs at North Park University in Chicago, Illinois. He was the recipient of North Park University's Hawkinson Award for Teaching Excellence and Campus Leadership. After 2009, Dilworth accepted a position as a professor of music at Temple University in Pennsylvania. Currently, Dilworth is the chair of the Music Education and Music Therapy Department at Temple University, where he has been honored with the Temple University Faculty Award for Research and Creative Achievement. Dilworth is currently National Board Chair for Chorus America. He is an active life member of the American Choral Directors Association. He also holds memberships with several other organizations, including the National Association for Music Education, the National Association of Negro Musicians, and the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers. As you can see, we have an impressive program for you. Thank you for attending. I hope you enjoy and find inspiration from today's event. Now, please join me in welcoming Randye Jones and Rollo Dilworth.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Randye Jones, and I thank you so much for inviting me to talk with you this afternoon. I have had a lifelong appreciation of the spiritual, and look to every opportunity I can to share that music with as many people as I can. I wanted to introduce you, I guess, to spirituals. I don't know, but some of you I suspect are going to be very familiar with the music. Some only somewhat familiar, and there probably will be, I imagine, a number of you who are not at all really familiar with the spiritual. So I'm going to just ask those of you who know it really well to indulge me a little bit and let me bring it, other folks a little more up to date with what's going on, what the music is. Spirituals really began with the first Africans who were brought here uh, as slaves. They had they were taken, brought to the United States, and not really allowed the opportunity to have their own culture, their history, their music, their dance. They were not able to have these things as part of their existence as slaves. So basically, this music, they would hear the music that was sung in the services and so forth, and they basically they took on this music just as well as they took on Christianity, the religion that they were exposed to when they came to this country, and they made it their own. Whenever they had the opportunity to gather, usually secretly, they would use that music. They would use the music that they heard that came from inside their own hearts uh, to express themselves, the terrible things they were experiencing as slaves, the loss of members of their family who were pulled away from them, the abuses they dealt with on a day-to-day basis. And this music was basically created spontaneously. Songs that we are now very familiar with, they suddenly, just were inspired and created this music. Um, Generally, we don't have a lot of background information about how the spiritual became a separate form of music. Um, we have a great deal of speculation, but unfortunately, because it is an oral tradition, spread by word of mouth, from person to person, from plantation to plantation, we really don't have a lot of documented history there. But we do have sometimes a master or a visitor to a plantation would hear this wonderful music and would write about it. Um, and so we would have those few snippets of history that are available to us. But reaching basically the end of the Civil War, um, an effort was made to try to document some of this music. Fortunately, some of that has been preserved. But what I think we want to deal with now is looking at it as far as a music that becomes part of our history as a country. Um, at the end of the Civil War, slaves were given their freedom, and there were organizations that made an attempt to create institutions such as colleges, religious organizations, etc., to begin educating these freed slaves. One of the institutions which became internationally known was Fisk, or what's now known as Fisk University. When it was begun back in I believe it was 1871, they really were not financially very well established. So they ended up having to tour and raise money that way. And these 9 young people, along with their accompanying director, um, went around the country. They performed. They weren't very well received at first because what people had heard and thought of as being Black music was what they really associated with minstrelsy. So when these young people went out and they were singing in a dignified, professional manner, they were not very well received until they began singing spirituals, the music of their community, of their what the music that they knew. And then suddenly this music was received with extraordinary response from people around the world. They ended groups formed, professional and collegiate Jubilee singers. Um, Song books came out, plantation songs, etc. Eventually, we end up in a situation where we have composers such as H.T. Burleigh, who realized that this music had great significance and it really needed to be the foundation of a musical style that could become our music as far as the United States, being the American music. He began writing spirituals, taking spirituals and using them as context for his compositions, including starting with Deep River in 1916, 1917. And then he and other composers took this music and developed it for concert performance. Um, I think the main thing with the spiritual, though, most importantly, is that it does serve as root music. It is the music that we Americans, whether we know it or not, have used as a structure for other music styles that have developed over the years, from ragtime, jazz, um, to more popular contemporary music. Everything that that we think of as being American music begins really, if you wanted to look down through the roots, begins with the spiritual. And so I'm also then, I think this is my opportunity to turn it over to Rollo, who is going to talk about gospel music because it, like other musical styles of the American diaspora, if you want to look at it from that perspective, um, also has a connection with the spiritual.
Thank you, Randye, so much for introducing us to the African American spiritual. So as Randye was saying, the spirituals really began to be documented post-Civil War. And what was also interesting to note is that as African Americans were freed through the Emancipation Proclamation, they were still, of course, experiencing racial segregation and being disenfranchised in the United States. And so sort of a secular form that developed after the spiritual was the blues. And from the blues, we got ragtime and jazz, and then we got gospel. Gospel music really started out as a movement around the turn of the century. Before gospel music became sort of labeled as an official genre, if you will, gospel music was really more of a movement and more of a technique. So if we think back at the beginning of the last century, there were many religious movements that were taking place in the United States. There was the Pentecostal movement taking form out on the West Coast. There was the holiness movement that was taking place in the South, particularly in Memphis, for example. There was African Methodism that had already gotten started in the late 1700s, but continue to proliferate throughout many parts of the United States, particularly in the Northeast, in Philadelphia, in New York. And all of these places were performing as part of worship many of the African American communities were performing spirituals and hymns, European hymns even. But what was making this music move toward the gospel idiom, the gospel style that was being developed, is that African Americans were performing this music in church using the techniques and the stylings and the rhythms and the vocalizations that were very much African. And so it wasn't uncommon to hear a European hymn by Isaac Watts being sung in a very slow, sort of drawn out manner called lining out of hymns. And you could also hear some European hymnody that was being sung with more of a swing style, or with more rhythmic emphasis to it, or with beginnings with piano accompaniment, or even accompanied by guitar or banjo or mandolin. And so this sort of style of singing and performing these hymns as well as these spirituals really sort of created what we now know as gospel music. But in those days, these singers and these musicians were gospelizing these hymns. Many of you, some of you, of course, may have heard of a gentleman by the name of Thomas Dorsey, who is known as the father of gospel music. And I'll get to him in more detail in just a moment. But preceding the work of Dorsey was a gentleman by the name of Charles Albert Tinley. And Charles Albert Tinley was writing music right around the turn of the century. His most popular hymn was probably a publication in 1904 called "The Storm is Passing Over." Many of you may have heard that piece. And so Charles Albert Tinley was a very well-trained musician, and he was a Philadelphia-based minister, and he was writing new hymns for the African-American church. Very much like spirituals, these hymns were reflecting the lives and the lived experiences of African Americans. And so many of the early gospel songs that were written, these gospel hymns, were placed into a book in the 1920s called Gospel Pearls. And that's really the time in history in which the term gospel was starting to be used to not just designate a movement or a technique, but to really sort of designate an actual genre. So if you get a chance, look at a book called The Gospel Pearls. It's still being published to this day. I think they're still using the original engraving plates from 1921, believe it or not. And it really has become a staple in African-American church worship. And again, it includes spirituals and it includes these hymns. And believe it or not, Thomas A. Dorsey's, one of his first hymns was actually published in the Gospel Pearls in 1921. Fast forward from 1921 to 1932, Thomas Dorsey was a Chicago-based composer. He was originally born in Georgia, and he was a blues musician by the name of Georgia. His stage name was Georgia Tom. And he moved to Chicago to increase his education, but he also kept vacillating back and forth between the secular world of performing and the sacred. So he was working in churches, but he was also working in clubs. He was very well known on the jazz scene. And it really, his career as a gospel composer started to take root in the 1930s when unfortunately he was on his way from Chicago to St. Louis to a revival. And when he got to St. Louis, he received a telegram that his wife was very ill. His wife was expecting their firstborn child. And by the time he rushed back to Chicago, unfortunately, his wife had passed away. The baby was delivered safely, but within a few days, the baby passed away as well. Dorsey went into seclusion for several days, and as he was praying and reflecting and, of course, mourning the death of his wife and his newborn child, the words to "Take my hand, precious Lord," came to him. And that piece has sort of I guess, sort of crystallized the gospel movement, and really to this day has been translated into over 40 languages, and it's in many hymns around the country. Unlike the spirituals, which were much more sort of rural in their development, gospel music really began to take shape in major cities around the country. So it had more sort of urban roots. It had blues and jazz influences. And in its early days, there were some churches that didn't allow gospel music or didn't favor it because it had all of these stylings of the blues and jazz, which was an oral, which was a secular tradition. And the spirituals were very much focused thematically on death and suffering, Old Testament and New Testament. Many of the slaves, as they conceived these songs in their hearts, as Randye talked about, were really focusing on the world, the life to come. They knew if they couldn't be free on earth, they knew that when they one day went to heaven through their faith convictions, that they would be free. Gospel music certainly talks about going to heaven and that faith experience as well, but it also talks about the heaven that can happen here on earth, which is much more New Testament based, which is why, you know, gospel meaning good news is what we refer to when we talk about gospel music. So I will stop there, and we can proceed further with the next part of our program.
Thank you very much. We had a question submitted by Jessica Yoder, a member of the Glee Club, and we're going to ask Jessica to pose that to you now. And if anybody is interested in sending in a question through the Q&A function, we hope to have some time later to ask some questions of our panelists. Jessica?
Hello. So I was wondering, when performing spirituals and gospel music, what type of content, how much and what type of context should be given to the audience? I would think that it might vary based on audience, choir, and the song. So could you give some examples of appropriate context surrounding the performance of a piece?
Randye, I think you're muted.
Can you hear me now? All right. Okay, it really depends for me on who my audience is, and then I will look at the music that I'm performing and what the context is. So for example, here in Grinnell, because I know that my audience tends to actually like a lot of program notes, I will generally write, and this is also an academic environment, I will write extensive program notes in addition to occasionally making a few comments during the program. But if I'm going into an environment where I know that, say for example, in a conference environment where I know that the attendees tend to be very well versed in Negro spirituals, then no, I'm not going to spend a lot of time writing at least general notes. I might have something to say about a specific piece, or if I'm focusing on a specific composer, I may have some notes that I put in for that. But it just really, I try to tailor what I'm writing to focus on who that audience is.
My response would be similar to Randye's. I think that it really depends on the audience. It depends on the context of the entire program. But I think that it is very important for artists, in most cases, to demonstrate his or her or their understanding of the African American spiritual. What kind of research have they done? What kind of study have they engaged in order to prepare them to sing the music, to perform the music with a high level of artistic integrity. I think that positionality is something that's very important to be stated, whether it's in your program notes, whether you make an announcement in your in the actual concert program itself, or there are times when your positionality can come through the actual performance itself. You can, maybe even with minimal discussion or minimal program notes, you can demonstrate through your performance what you have learned and how you have work to make sure that you clearly understand what this music is about.
Thank you both for those responses. So I'd like to continue by mentioning that in your book, Randye, there's a chapter that is titled, and I'm quoting the title, "Must You Be Black to Sing Spirituals?" And of course, we could ask the same question about gospel. How would each of you respond to that question?
Rollo, do you want to go first, or I don't want to jump all over this every time, but you know, if you want to slide in here, if not, I can certainly go with it.
Go right ahead, and then I'll jump in.
Okay. All right. The Negro spiritual is an American music, and it has been influenced not only by its African roots, but also by European music and other musics that the slaves were exposed to. So I don't really think of it as being strictly my music as an African American. I like to believe that the music itself communicates itself no matter what your race is. That just because I have advantages because I'm exposed to the culture, not because of my skin tone. I have known people who have been extraordinary interpreters of Negro spirituals who were not African American. I have also known of African Americans who, oh my goodness, have done, I don't want to say, well, no, I'm not going to say the term that came to my mind, but really were not effective interpreters of spirituals because they simply didn't know the music. They hadn't bothered to take the time to learn the music. And they basically turned it into what I thought of as being an academic presentation. So really, the race of the performer is not the issue. The issue is, are you willing to learn the song, to learn the style of the music and its interpretation, to learn what stylistic options you have as a musician for presenting that music, to learn what, and probably even more important than some of the other things I've mentioned, beyond the fact, is to learn who the composer is, what that composer's expectations were. There are some composers who, understanding that the Negro spiritual in its original form was a very much it was folk music. And so people sang this music as they felt led to at the moment. And that didn't mean it was a very structured all the time, you know. In fact, it's very difficult to sometimes even notate. But the people who were singing sang with the idea of being able to express themselves. And so the composer may have the attitude that, yes, you as a singer are free to interpret what I've written. And then there are going to be some composers, for example, one of the earliest and best known composers, Hall Johnson. If he wrote it down, that's what he wanted you to sing. And I simply go with the philosophy that if the composer wanted you to sing this and this was what you should be singing, please do that. On the other end, I have also heard of some extraordinary compositions, for example, by John Carter, who wrote a beautiful five-song, five-section, because the first section is actually for piano, but five-section cycle called Cantata. And he actually interviewed and said he had no problem about interpreting, the singer adding some interpretation. On the other end, I've listened to that work and I don't know that there's a lot of space in there for interpretive deviation by the singer that doesn't seem to clash against what the piano is doing. all of that said, I think I've drifted a little bit away from your original question, but it really comes down to, are you as a musician capable of taking a musical style, whether you're born and raised with it or whether you need to learn it? And are you capable of taking that musical style, exploring it, learning how it works? And do you have the technical and interpretive skill to be able to bring it off? I had an excerpt from a recording that I wanted to share with you. I don't know if this is a good time to play that or not, but I think it's certainly an appropriate time. The singer is Marilyn Horne. She is, I think she's really far more known as an opera singer, but she has made a couple of recordings of spirituals, and I'm only going to ask that they play the last couple of minutes simply because of time constraints, but it really gives you a very strong sense, I believe, of how a singer can learn and develop and express themselves performing what is probably one of the best known spirituals there is. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. So let's let Miss Horne show you how to sing a spiritual. And if you want to try to follow that, go for it.
Wow, what a powerful performance. Well, I certainly won't try to sing, that's for sure. Thank you, Randye. That was just a wonderful response. And I will just echo what you said and just add to it a little bit in that spirituals and gospels, but specifically spirituals, they are born out of African-American traditions, born out of African-American experience, but they are to be celebrated and sung and performed by all. I've been mentioning to my colleagues over the months that there is no published arrangement of a spiritual or gospel piece out there that has a little asterisk next to the title and a footnote at the bottom of the page that says to be sung by African Americans only, or to be sung by those of African descent only. As Randye said, if you invest yourself in really understanding style and performance practice in historical context, you will have the credibility and the integrity to do this music and to do it well. There are elements within spirituals and gospel music that is what I would consider to be culturally specific. But at the same time, there are also elements in these songs that are what I call humanly universal. And it's those humanly universal elements like suffering, like loss, like pain, like marginalization. These are things these are themes that are in spirituals and in gospel music that are universal to every human being that is on this earth. And so you don't have to be a person of African descent whose ancestors experienced slavery in order to understand some of the human emotions that are very much ingrained and are at the core of this music. So I would encourage anyone out there to do this music and to do your homework and make sure that you understand it thoroughly as you are attempting to perform this music.
Thank you. That's very helpful and informative, and we are very grateful for your answers. So it seems that you both agree that the answer to the original question is no. In other words, that it is okay. And in fact, if I may, almost recommended that a group like the Smith College Glee Club perform spirituals and gospel. If we do so, it certainly seems like we need to be sensitive to the potential of cultural appropriation. So I'm wondering if you might speak about this both generally, but also specifically as it applies to our conversation today.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, I would love to talk a little bit about cultural appropriation. I think that there is the general understanding of cultural appropriation out there, especially as it pertains to the arts, is that cultural appropriation should be, has a negative context, and that has a negative connotation, negative context, and that cultural appropriation is a bad thing. And the scholars out there on cultural appropriation actually help us to more clearly understand that there's a wide range of types of cultural appropriation that exist out there. And I know Randy's going to talk a little bit about cultural appreciation. What I want to do is give a general definition of what cultural appropriation is. And the term is really predicated on this understanding or this idea that in any context, people will perceive themselves or others as being an insider or an outsider. There is this insider versus outsider kind of lens through which the term cultural appropriation, I think, gets its power and its energy. So James Young, who is a very well-known philosopher, wrote a book called Cultural Appropriation in the Arts in 2008. And he says that cultural appropriation happens when members of one culture, i.e. outsiders, take for their own use, items produced by a member or members of another culture, i.e. the insiders. Now, another scholar by the name of Richard Rogers says that cultural appropriation is the use of one's cultures, symbols, artifacts, genres, rituals, or technologies by members of another culture, regardless of intent, ethics, function, or outcome. So the way that they describe cultural appropriation, it's clear to us that anytime we borrow or take on or represent the culture, the ideas, the customs, the ways of being of a culture or a community outside of one that we represent, we're actually committing an act of cultural appropriation. That does not necessarily mean that every act of cultural appropriation is a bad act. They go on to say that cultural appropriation is absolutely inescapable. We're living in a global society in which we are combining ideas, and cultures from all over the world are coming together and sharing ideas, and there's no way to run away from it. Take, for example, earrings. I think many people around the world, including the United States, wears earrings, right? Well, earrings actually originated centuries ago in North Africa, in Egypt, and also parts of South Asia, formerly known as sort of Persia, that area. Well, if you literally want to think about that in terms of cultural appropriation, That means everybody who is not of North African or South Asian descent is committing an act of cultural appropriation every time they put on a pair of earrings. Is that offensive? Probably not, because it's so much a part of our culture and our society that many people do it. And so we have to be able to divorce ourselves from this notion that all acts of cultural appropriation are offensive and inappropriate. There are elements of cultural appropriation that are inappropriate, but the ones that are appropriate include things such as cultural exchange, which is the reciprocal exchange of symbols, artifacts, rituals, and genres between cultures with roughly equal levels of power. When the power dynamic is uneven, it is no longer cultural exchange, and in that instance, it is considered offensive. There's also something called cultural appreciation, and this is when elements of a culture are used while honoring the source that they came from. It's important to note that appreciation involves respect and value. And I know that Randy's going to talk about that in a little bit. And then there's something that I call in my own research, cultural consumption. And that's when we harmlessly or even unknowingly interact or adapt behaviors and cultures outside of our own. And it may not be for the purposes of exploitation, it just may be for the purposes of consumption. For example, I get off the plane in Honolulu, and as I'm coming off the plane, I'm greeted by folks who are welcoming me to Hawaii, and they put a lei on me. And I walk through the airport, and I am excited to be in Hawaii. Well, wearing that lei is not something that I'm doing to offend Native Hawaiians. I'm simply consuming and being a part of the culture in the moment, and I'm, enjoying the culture and perhaps even consuming it by eating foods and that sort of thing. So I will stop there, but I wanted to be very clear about what cultural appropriation is and help us all to understand, specifically in the arts, how there are varying types of cultural appropriation, and the types of cultural appropriation that we engage in really determine whether or not it is acceptable or objectionable or offensive. I'll stop there.
I am going to take a slightly different historical stance, and or not stance, but actually just sort of to explain some things that might, I think, clarify where the concern about appropriation comes from as far as Negro spiritual concerned. Back in the 19th century, one of the things that became extremely popular and back into the 20th century was the use of what is termed minstrelsy, where to make jest of, to put down Black slaves, former slaves, they made up an entertainment and used the music of the African experience, the African American experience, and turned it into music that was intended to make fun of these people. And in a lot of respects, the only exposure that a lot of American whites had was to minstrelsy. They would develop a whole career around performing songs that were written to make fun of African Americans. And so as the time has passed, even though minstrelsy, blackface, which is a part of minstrelsy, has become unpopular, and in fact, you hear every once in a while a politician will pop up and they'll discover that a picture of this person in blackface. Yes, that is very wrong, but it existed and is a part of American history. And it also does color how people perceive when someone is choosing to sing a spiritual or gospel music. Are you performing that as a serious musician, or is it minstrelsy? Or is it some other means of trying to put down another culture? So with that in mind, I guess I want to try to encourage you to look at the music that you're contemplating the singing of a spiritual or gospel music. What is your reason for doing that? If your reason is to put down someone, a culture you don't understand, then yes, that is not a good way of performing that music, and you have far better things you can do with your time, honestly. But if the idea is to try to understand and to appreciate, not just what these people did as a historical significance, but who these people were, what kind of things that they were going through, how they expressed themselves. It's, for example, I think of as a musician, the expectation to become a classically trained singer is that I am supposed to study German lead, French melody. I chose too that because of my vocal capabilities at that time. I also wanted to study things like Baroque music, and so I could understand the copper aria and and what sort of ornamentations were appropriate for that style of music. The same thing when I decide that if I decide that I want to learn a Russian folk melody or whatever. The idea is that I be able to, first of all, as a person, to have a depth of understanding about where other people are experiencing things. What is it about their culture that makes them distinctive, that makes them someone that I would want to know as a person, because their history, their experiences have colored their experiences in ways that my culture, my history, my experience have colored me as a human being. If I can, anything that I can do that would help me understand that person more, I want to do that. As a musician, I want, if there are technical things that I can pick up from a song, whatever style of music that is, I want that experience so I can increase my depth of knowledge as a musician, so that I can understand what's going on when I attend a concert. I can listen to that music and I can hear things harmonically, melodically, with the words that are chosen, what that music means. And of course, that then makes it more important, more special to me, even as a listener, because I understand what's being communicated. I don't know where I heard this reference, and it might well be, I'll remember it 5 minutes after this presentation. But there really is a true difference between appropriation and appreciation. When you appropriate, as Rollo has mentioned, you're not really doing anything that's going to be a positive to either to yourself or to anyone you're in contact with. It's something you're taking from someone. When you appreciate, when you're looking to understand, that is a totally different perspective. You want, hopefully by appreciating someone else's music, someone else's culture, you can understand them better. And in some respects, you might find that you understand yourself better.
Yeah, I just want to chime in and say that it really is a matter of respect and value. If you as an artist have respect for the music that you are trying to study and trying to, perform and perfect, then you're in the realm of appreciation. Appropriation occurs as an offense when there is a lack of respect for the music, when culture is sort of used as a gimmick, when there is a lack of pursuit of the history and the context of the music, when there is a lack of willingness, perhaps if it's like an indigenous folk piece of music, let's say it's Native American, if there's no desire to reach out or connect with the communities that have created this music to better understand and to gain a further a level of respect for the music, then that's considered offensive. So I think that it behooves us as artists to make sure that we are pursuing this music, as Randye said, from a perspective of respect, and that there is value to this music. And I would go so far as to say value of, African American spirituals at the same level that we value music of the Western canon. And that sometimes can be challenging and problematic because oftentimes our institutions don't necessarily place the same level of emphasis and therefore the same level of value on music that is outside of the Western canon. So that is something that we as artists have to do. We have to own that value, and we have to respect the music at that same level.
One thing too I wanted to mention, and I think this is as good a place as any to do so. One of the things too that we need to also be aware of as we're studying this music is to not only look at the notation, that you see on the sheet of music, but to also to understand when you're looking at music, sometimes it's going to require you to study the text that you're singing, especially if you're singing something is in dialect. The African American, the slave spiritual, often, even with concert spirituals, you're going to see the presence of dialect. And you as a musician will have to decide, first of all, am I comfortable singing in dialect? Notice I did not say, am I, as a Black person, comfortable singing dialect? That's not really the question. A person who is not African American can still sing dialect. They have to learn, just like I had to learn how to sing in German because I am not a German native. You might find yourself in a position of having to understand the different ways that dialect can be enunciated, especially because you not only have to think about it from a perspective of speaking dialect, but also singing. And those of you who study singing, you have to not only have to worry about pronouncing a word a certain way, but you also have to be able to perform that word. If you're singing in high A, you cannot sing the same vowel sounds as you might be able to if you were in the middle of your vocal range. So you might have to make adaptations. And when you're singing in dialect, you probably are going to be uncomfortable with it if you're not familiar with it. And it's going to take work and time and effort to be able to find the way of pronouncing that dialect cleanly, and still, because remember, as a performer, you are still communicating. So whether you're singing in dialect or standard English, you still have to enunciate those words so that they are clearly understood to the audience. So whether that's gospel, spirituals, or whatever, the words and the music still need to be communicated to your audience. So, if you're not comfortable singing in dialect, there are a multitude of songs available to you there where the composer and the publisher did not use dialect. What I would suggest, though, is that you don't want to necessarily sing in straight standard English. That is one of a major clue that you don't really know how to sing that style of music. Try different things such as softening the final consonants, especially, and basically work your way towards being more and more comfortable with that style of music. And that's true no matter what style of music you're singing. The first song that you ever learned, a French melody, if you've never sung in French, probably sounds considerably different than what you're going to sing on your final recital if you're a voice major, because you will have learned a variety of songs in French that hopefully have given you the opportunity to develop not only a knowledge of the different French composers and what they their expectations were, but also the language. So do the same thing with dialect or whatever aspect of whatever of the Negro spiritual gospel music, that you need to make those positive steps so that you become more comfortable with that music.
Thank you. Those were really informative and thorough answers. And the subject of dialect was actually one that was posed by somebody in the Q&A. We just have a couple minutes left, but so there was also a question from someone: what effect did the Great Awakening have on Black spiritual music? So I wonder if you would speak about that briefly. But I can't help but want to ask Rollo, in terms of dialect, you publish many original compositions, but also arrangements of pre-existing songs, pieces which may have had dialect spellings in them. And I just wonder, how do you make the decision whether to leave the original texts alone or to alter them and print them solely in modern English?
Thank you. That's a good question. Most of my spiritual arrangements have some dialect, but not maybe to the same extent as you would see in earlier arrangements of spirituals. And that's because, you know, the African American spiritual is not a fixed art form. It continues to evolve over time. And there are certain performance practices that are sort of baked into, as Randye said, into performance of the text that I, you know, write about or assume that some people have taken for granted at this particular point. But there are some of the endings, like you rarely see a word ending in ing in my arrangements, and that's because we know that that phonetic decay is something that has to be consistently reinforced, and I want to make sure that it's there. But I also will write into my scores, even if I have the word T-H-A-T, I will write in many of the scores that you can use a softer T or more of a D sound, but certainly if you use a more dentalized T at the beginning of the word, you certainly wouldn't use it at the end of the word, for example. And so there are rules that or the road that I put into my music. And I think that will vary across many arrangers depending upon their own style and their own interpretation. And that continues to be a varied, that tends to vary still to this day between myself and a Moses Hogan, for example. If you go back and look at Dawson's arrangements, or if you look at John Work's arrangements, you're going to find something maybe a little different. And that's just because the genre continues to evolve, but yet there is always this understanding, at least in my own writings, about how to interpret the text, particularly when pronouncing certain words.
And I will give one other suggestion. H.T. Burley, who is basically the pioneer for solo vocal Negro spirituals, there is a collection of his that basically explores his entire career of writing Negro spirituals for solo voice. And some of his spirituals, for example, Deep River, his very first, has no dialect in it at all. But as a singer, I make decisions about the amount of dialect. I tend for that song to only soften final consonants. I don't use dialect primarily, first of all, because he didn't. But then also I feel like the power of the song is so linked to the words that I want to make sure that every word comes through very clearly. And it's such a beautiful, simple song. It really doesn't need a lot of spicing of any of sort. You really just need to hear the clarity and the cleanness of that song. But then again, Burley had some songs in his collection that are very heavily spiced, as it were, with dialect. And so I'm comfortable singing in dialect, in heavy dialect, and so I've chosen some of those pieces because I'm very comfortable with them. But again, if I have a young student who is not terribly familiar, then I might start with a piece that doesn't have those same dialect requirements, and work from there.
Thank you for that. We are at the end of our session, and so I want to make sure to thank Randye Jones and Rollo Dilworth for their extremely thorough and very informative answers to all of our questions today. And thank you, LaTanya Richmond, for your wonderful welcome. If I'm sure that people feel that they need to be leaving, but if you wouldn't mind just giving us a brief answer to a question from the audience about what effect the Great Awakening had on Black sacred music, I think we'll feel very complete with our coverage of our topics today.
Sure, I can jump in very quickly and go back to the 18th century for just a moment. Well, we know that African Americans were listening to all types of musical experiences, and they, of course, were learning Christianity anew here in the United States. And no doubt that as they were listening to some of the hymnody that was a part of the Great Awakening, that accompanied the Great Awakening, as well as engaging or learning about sort of the religious fervor that sparked the Pentecostal, that later sparked the Pentecostal and holiness movements, that certainly African American sacred music was influenced very much by that. And the framework that gospel music took on was no doubt, again, influenced by some of the hymnody that African Americans were singing, but singing through their own lens and adding African stylings to them, and which is what began to branch off into what we know as the beginnings of gospel music.
Thank you, Rollo, and thank you again, everybody, for attending today. I hope everyone enjoyed our presentation, and please feel free to visit some of the links that have been posted in the chat, which have more information about our topic today. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.